Hello. The price of betrayal, my wife's affair and ruthless plan uncovered. My name's Daniel, and I've been married to my wife, Sophie, for 8 years. We've built a life together, 3 beautiful kids, a big house in a nice part of town, and a comfortable lifestyle that I've worked my ass off to give her. Sophie doesn't work, she takes care of the house, raises the kids, and really, she has everything she could want. We've got help at home too, housekeepers, a gardener, a cook, you name it. All I ever asked of her was to look after the kids and keep things running smoothly at home. A couple of years ago, when our 3rd child was born, I decided to hire a personal driver for Sophie. I figured it would make her life easier, you know. She could go shopping, visit friends, or just get around without having to worry about driving. She loved the idea, and I didn't think twice about it. Everything seemed fine, more than fine, honestly. From the outside, our life was the kind people dream about. But lately, something's been gnawing at me, this feeling that something's not quite right. Sophie has changed. I've noticed it in little things. She's always been independent and sharp, but recently, there's been this shift in her. She's more secretive, more distant, and I keep catching her lying about small things. Nothing major, but enough to make me question her. She's good at covering her tracks too, so good that I've started wondering if I'm just being paranoid. But deep down, I know something is off. I just don't know what yet. So, a couple of days ago, something strange happened. It was late, probably around 11 p.m. Sophie had already gone to bed, but I was up, finishing some work in the study. All of a sudden, I heard a noise outside, like a car engine idling for too long. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, we live in a good neighborhood, and people sometimes park outside for a bit before leaving. But this time, it felt different. I went to check, but by the time I got outside, the car was gone. It left this weird feeling in my gut. I didn't want to freak Sophie out, so I didn't mention it to her. But the next morning, while she was getting the kids ready for their clubs, the feeling still lingered. She was heading out for the day with the driver, taking the kids to their soccer and ballet classes, and I had the house to myself for a few hours. I couldn't shake the thought of last night. That's when the idea hit me, why not install cameras? For safety, I told myself. After all, we live in a big house, and with the kids running around and Sophie home alone a lot, it made sense. I'm not normally the paranoid type, but with all the little things adding up, the strange car, Sophie's sudden secrecy, I decided it was the right move. So while Sophie was out with the kids, I had a team come in and install cameras around the house. Nothing too invasive, just covering the main areas like the front and back entrances, the driveway, and one inside the living room where we spend most of our time. I even had one set up facing the street, to catch anything suspicious that might happen outside. At first, it was just for peace of mind. But part of me couldn't help but wonder if these cameras would capture more than just safety footage. Maybe it was stupid, but something deep down told me to keep an eye on things. Sophie had been acting off for weeks now, those late-night phone calls she brushed off as nothing, the way she seemed distant even when we were together. I didn't want to believe anything bad was going on, but the nagging doubts wouldn't go away. I figured, if I'm wrong, then no harm done. But if I'm right, well, I'd rather know the truth than keep living in the dark. A week went by, and things felt normal. Almost too normal, if I'm being honest. Sophie kept up with her usual routine, taking the kids to their clubs, meeting up with her friends for lunch, and doing the usual shopping trips with the driver. The house felt calm, and there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But that feeling from the week before still hadn't gone away. I didn't have the time to comb through hours of camera footage myself, running my business kept me too busy, and honestly, I didn't want to obsess over it. So, I made the call to hire a professional service. They'd go through the footage, cut it down, and only send me anything unusual. It felt like a good plan. If there was nothing to worry about, I'd get that peace of mind. If there was, well, I'd cross that bridge when I got to it. A week passed without anything happening. No weird noises outside, no late-night phone calls from Sophie that I could catch. I almost started to believe maybe I was just paranoid, that the cameras were an overreaction. Then, 2 days ago, I got an email from the security team I hired. Footage found, it said, with an attachment. My stomach dropped as I opened it. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, the cursor hovering over the file. I wasn't sure what I was going to see, but something in me knew this was going to change everything. I told myself maybe it was nothing, maybe just the mailman or a neighbor walking by. But deep down, I knew. There was something in that file that was about to turn my world upside down. I clicked play. I sat there, watching the footage, waiting for something, anything, that might explain the uneasy feeling I'd had for weeks. At first, it all seemed normal. The driver, Michael, showing up like he always did. He was always polite, helping Sophie bring in the bags after her shopping trips or picking up the kids. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was almost starting to feel embarrassed for having set up the cameras in the first place. In the video, they brought in the bags together, just like always. Sophie offered him a drink, and they went into the kitchen for tea. I watched them sit and talk. It was casual, too casual, I thought. But nothing strange, nothing to worry about. Maybe I had just been sent all the clips where there was movement, and nothing more. It seemed routine, almost mundane. But something in me told me to keep watching, to look closer. So, I fast-forwarded through the rest of the footage, expecting to find more of the same. The minutes ticked by, just more clips of Sophie and Michael chatting, her going about her day, him leaving as usual. Then, it happened. As I was rewinding, trying to speed through another clip, a single frame flashed across the screen, a naked body. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I rewound again, more slowly this time, afraid of what I was about to uncover. And then, there it was. The screen showed Sophie. Sitting on top of Michael. Her clothes were off, his hands were on her, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. It didn't even seem real, but there it was, right in front of me. My wife, the woman I had built my entire life with, was having sex with our driver. In our home. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the image burned into my mind. My whole body felt numb. This wasn't just some suspicion or a bad feeling, it was the cold, hard truth. Sophie had been lying to me. For how long? I had no idea. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, my life, it was all unraveling. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I just kept replaying the scene, hoping somehow it would change. But it didn't. The more I watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't a one-time thing. This was something else. Something much worse than I could have imagined. After seeing that footage, everything in me screamed for revenge. My world had just crumbled in front of me, and the woman I'd built my life around was tearing it apart with our driver, right in the home I had worked so hard to provide for her. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was angry. Furious, actually. But this wasn't the kind of situation where I could just storm in, yell, and throw her out. No, Sophie was too smart for that. She was a professional liar, always covering her tracks, always twisting things to make herself look perfect to the outside world. If I wanted to take her down, I had to be smarter. I knew that confronting her right away wouldn't work. We live in a state where proving infidelity can be tricky in court, and if I just reacted out of anger, I'd lose everything, my house, my kids, my money. I needed a plan. A way to make sure Sophie didn't come out of this looking innocent while I was left with nothing. The first thing I did was save the footage, back it up in multiple places. No way was I losing that. This was my leverage, my proof. I also made sure not to let on that I knew anything. I had to act normal around her, even though every time I looked at her, all I could see was that image of her with Michael. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew I needed to stay calm if this plan was going to work. The next step was talking to a lawyer. But not just any lawyer, I wanted the best. If Sophie thought she was going to walk away from this unscathed, she was wrong. I set up a meeting and explained everything, showing the footage as proof. My lawyer was shocked but impressed by how much evidence I had gathered. We went over my options, and that's when I realized just how careful I had to be. Sophie had rights too, and without a clear plan, she could easily twist this to her advantage. But I was prepared. The goal wasn't just divorce, it was to make sure Sophie didn't take half of everything. I had worked too hard for all of this. If she thought she could cheat on me and walk away with the house, the money, and full custody of the kids, she had another thing coming. I wanted her to pay for what she'd done. And Michael? He wasn't going to get away either. I had a plan brewing for him too, but first things first, I needed to make sure Sophie felt the sting of what she had done. Over the next few days, I began collecting more evidence, bank statements, emails, anything that could paint a picture of the life she'd been living behind my back. I needed to know how long this affair had been going on and what else she might have been hiding. Every detail mattered. My lawyer advised me to play it cool for a little while longer, to make sure all the pieces were in place before I dropped the bomb on her. But revenge was coming. Sophie had no idea what was about to hit her. The hardest part of the plan wasn't gathering the evidence or meeting with the lawyer. It was staying calm in front of Sophie. Every day I had to pretend like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't counting down the moments until I could finally confront her. But I couldn't hold it in anymore. I needed to make the first move. One morning, while the kids were out at school, I decided it was time. I walked into the kitchen, where Sophie was sitting with her coffee, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I sat down, which was ironic considering what I was about to drop on her. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Sophie," I said, leaning back in my chair. "We need to talk. I'm filing for divorce." Her head snapped up, and for a moment, she just stared at me. The shock in her eyes was almost satisfying, like she never imagined this day would come. She blinked a few times, then scoffed, clearly thinking this was some sort of joke. "What? What are you talking about, Daniel? Divorce? Where is this coming from?" I stayed quiet for a moment, letting the weight of my words sink in. I could see the confusion spreading across her face, but also the panic. She wasn't used to being out of control, and it was starting to show. "I've made my decision," I said, keeping it short. "I'll be moving forward with the process." She stood up, slamming her phone down on the counter. Wait, what the hell is going on? You can't just spring this on me. Is this about someone else? Do you have someone else, Daniel? Is that what this is?" Her voice was rising, and the calm kitchen was quickly turning into a battlefield. But I wasn't giving her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. I stayed seated, watching as she circled around the counter, her mind clearly racing. "You've got someone else, don't you?" she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "That's why you're doing this. You think you can just replace me? I'll take everything from you, Daniel. The house, the cars, the kids, everything. You're not walking away from this like some hero. You're the one with something to hide, aren't you?" She stormed closer, pointing a finger at me like she was ready to attack. The sheer audacity of her, threatening me like she hadn't been the one sneaking around with our driver. But I kept my poker face on. She had no idea what was coming. "You want a divorce? Fine. But don't think for 1 second I'm walking away with nothing. I'll make sure I get the kids, the house, and everything you've ever worked for. You're not leaving me with nothing." She was shaking now, her voice rising in anger, but also fear. That's when I realized she thought she still had the upper hand. She thought this was about me moving on or having an affair of my own. She was trying to intimidate me, but I could see right through it. She had no idea what I had already collected on her. I stood up, walking past her, my face calm. "We'll see about that," I said, heading for the door. "You don't know what I've got, Sophie. And I'm going to keep it that way, until the trial." She froze, her face going pale. She had no clue what I meant, but for the first time, she wasn't in control. The power had shifted, and I wasn't going to let her take it back. The day of the trial came faster than I expected. I had spent weeks preparing, working closely with my lawyer to make sure every piece of evidence was airtight. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting to keep my kids, my house, and everything I had worked for. Sophie, on the other hand, walked into the courtroom with the same smug look she'd had since our confrontation. She still thought she was in control, that this was going to go her way. She had no idea what was coming. As we sat down, the tension in the room was thick. Sophie sat across from me, her lawyer by her side, whispering things in her ear that made her smile. It was that same confident smile she wore every time she lied. I could feel my hands clenching, but I kept my composure. I had waited for this moment, and now it was time to watch her crumble. The trial started, and the usual proceedings took place. Her lawyer painted her as the perfect mother, the loving wife who had dedicated her life to raising our children. They made me out to be the distant husband, too focused on work to see what my wife needed. It was almost laughable, the way they tried to twist things. But I stayed quiet, waiting for my moment. Then, my lawyer stood up. He laid everything out, the evidence, the timeline, the carefully constructed case we had built. And finally, it was time for the video footage. I could feel Sophie's eyes on me, the confusion starting to creep into her expression. She had no idea what was about to hit her. The courtroom screens flickered to life, and there it was, the footage of her and Michael, clear as day. First, the innocent moments, him bringing in bags, sitting down for tea. She shifted in her seat, probably thinking that was all we had. But then it happened. The scene changed, and the frame I had stumbled upon weeks ago appeared on screen, Sophie, naked, on top of the driver. The courtroom was silent. You could hear a pin drop. Sophie's face turned red, her hands gripping the table in front of her. Her lawyer tried to object, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it now. I could see her starting to unravel. Her breathing got heavier, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had spent years perfecting her lies, building this facade, and now it was being torn apart in front of everyone. The judge watched, emotionless, while the video continued playing. I didn't need to say anything. The footage spoke for itself. Then, suddenly, Sophie snapped. "You bad," she screamed, standing up so fast that her chair clattered to the floor. "How could you do this to me?" She turned toward me, her face twisted in rage, completely losing control. "You set me up. You can't show this. I'll take everything. You hear me? Everything." Her voice echoed through the room, her fists clenched, and she lunged as if she wanted to tear me apart right there in the courtroom. The guards had to step in, grabbing her arms and pulling her back. She was thrashing, screaming curses, completely out of control. It was like watching a mask fall away, revealing the real Sophie underneath, the one who couldn't stand not being in control, the one who thought she could get away with everything. The judge called for order, but it was too late. Sophie was dragged out of the courtroom, still screaming, and I sat there in silence. It was over. The entire courtroom had seen the truth. There was no going back now. As the door slammed shut behind her, I realized this wasn't just about winning in court. This was about finally being free, from the lies, from her manipulation, from the person I thought I knew but never truly did. After the trial exposed Sophie's affair, the next battle was about the kids. This was the part one dreaded most. I'd always been a hands-on father, involved in every part of their lives, from school runs to bedtime stories. But Sophie was still their mother, and no matter how much I despised her for what she'd done, I knew this hearing would be brutal. Sophie was fighting tooth and nail for full custody, insisting that I was too focused on work to take care of the kids properly. But after what happened in court, I had no intention of letting her win. Not after everything I had uncovered. You see, during the divorce trial, I had asked my lawyer to dig deeper into everything. I wanted to know if Sophie was hiding more than just her affair with the driver, and what we found shocked me. I had always trusted her with the kids, but it turned out she had been neglecting them in ways I hadn't imagined. One of the first things we uncovered was a series of missed school meetings and doctor's appointments. Sophie had lied, telling me she was taking care of everything, but in reality, she had left it to the nanny or simply ignored it altogether. The kids' teachers had even sent home notes about behavioral issues, things Sophie had hidden from me. And then there were her unexplained absences, times when she was supposed to be with the children but was nowhere to be found. At first, I thought it was just her sneaking around with Michael, but it was worse. She had been going to bars, meeting random men, and partying while pretending she was being the doting mom at home. There were social media posts, tagged photos, and even receipts from nights out that aligned with times she was supposed to be caring for the kids. It wasn't just the affair, it was a pattern of reckless, selfish behavior that proved she wasn't the responsible parent she pretended to be. All of this came out during the custody hearing. My lawyer didn't hold back, presenting everything we had gathered. There were statements from the nanny, who admitted she had covered for Sophie more times than she could count. Doctors' records showing missed appointments. School reports that Sophie had signed off on but never shared with me. And then, the bombshell, Sophie's social media posts from nights she claimed to be home with the kids, showing her out drinking and partying. Sophie tried to defend herself, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that she had been overwhelmed, that she needed time to de-stress. But the judge wasn't buying it. The evidence was damning. I could see the frustration boiling up in Sophie as each piece of evidence was revealed. She was used to being in control, manipulating the narrative to suit her. But now, in front of the judge, her lies were catching up to her. She started crying, blaming me, saying I had hired too much help and pushed her away. It was desperate, and everyone in that room could see through it. When it came time for the judge to speak, I held my breath. This was it. Mrs. Williams, the judge began, her tone firm, the evidence presented today raises serious concerns about your ability to provide a stable and responsible environment for your children. Parenting is not just about being present, it's about being accountable, reliable, and consistent in your care. Based on what I've seen, you have failed in these areas. Sophie's face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. I am granting primary custody to Mr. Williams, the judge continued. Given the pattern of neglect, I cannot in good conscience allow the children to remain in your full-time care. You will have supervised visitation rights, pending further review. Sophie exploded again, just like in the divorce trial, yelling that it was all a setup, that I had turned everyone against her. But the judge wasn't having it. They called in security, and just like before, Sophie was escorted out of the room. This time, though, she wasn't just losing her dignity, she was losing her kids. As the courtroom cleared, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I had won, yes, but it wasn't a victory I wanted to celebrate. The children had lost their mother in the process, at least for now. But I knew it was for the best. I could give them the stability Sophie never could. The truth was out, and Sophie had no one left to blame but herself. The end of the trial came like a storm that had been building for months. It was the final day, the day that would decide everything, the house, the money, and most importantly, the kids. I had sat through countless hearings, endured Sophie's lies, accusations, and breakdowns, but this was it. The judge was about to give the final verdict. Sophie sat across from me, her once confident demeanor completely shattered. She looked tired, broken, and desperate, but still clinging to the hope that she could somehow walk away with something. She had threatened to take everything, my money, the house, the kids, but now, after all the evidence had been laid bare, it was clear that wasn't going to happen. The courtroom was silent as the judge began to speak. Mr. and Mrs. Williams, we have come to the conclusion of what has been a long and difficult process. After reviewing all the evidence, it is clear that this marriage has broken down beyond repair. More importantly, the well-being of the children must be our primary concern. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting around the room. She knew what was coming, but that didn't stop the anger from bubbling beneath the surface. Based on the evidence presented, it is my ruling that the assets of the marriage, including the house, vehicles, and joint financial accounts, shall remain in the possession of Mr. Williams. I exhaled, the tension in my chest finally releasing. The house, the place I had worked so hard to build for our family, was mine. Sophie sat frozen, her face pale, not believing what she was hearing. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Williams, given the severity of the evidence of your infidelity, reckless behavior, and neglectful parenting, you will be required to vacate the marital home immediately. Sophie's eyes went wide, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came out. You will be provided temporary housing arrangements until a more permanent solution is established, but as of today, you are no longer permitted to reside at the Williams household. Mr. Williams will have full custody of the children, and your visitation rights will remain supervised until further notice. The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't believe it, it was over. Everything Sophie had tried to take from me, everything she had lied about, was falling apart in front of her. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Sophie, on the other hand, was trembling with rage. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back in the process. This isn't fair, she screamed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. You can't take everything from me. This is my house too. Those are my kids. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but Sophie wasn't done. She stormed toward me, her face twisted with anger. You think you've won, Daniel? You think this is over, she spat. I'll find a way to make you pay for this. You can't just throw me out like trash. The guards moved in quickly, grabbing her arms before she could get any closer. She struggled against them, still yelling, but it was over. Her threats meant nothing now. The judge's ruling was final. As Sophie was escorted out of the courtroom, her voice fading down the hallway, I stood there in silence. The weight of everything, months of betrayal, court hearings, and emotional battles, was finally lifting off my shoulders. She was out of my life, and more importantly, she was out of my home. I wasn't celebrating. It wasn't a victory I wanted. But it was the closure I needed. As I left the courtroom and stepped outside into the fresh air, I realized this was the start of something new. Sophie was gone, and I could finally move forward, with my kids, my home, and my dignity intact. A month passed since the trial, and life was finally starting to settle into something that felt like normal. Sophie had tried to make good on her threats, claiming she would take everything, the house, the kids, the money, but none of it came true. She had nothing left to fight with, no leverage. The courts didn't side with her because they couldn't dig up anything on me. I kept my head down, followed every rule, and made sure to do right by my kids. As for the driver, Michael, I fired him immediately after the trial. The moment I stepped out of that courtroom, I told him I never wanted to see his face again. He knew he couldn't argue. He didn't even try. In exchange for me not hitting him, which, trust me, I was close to doing, he gave me one last confession. You should know, he said quietly, staring at the floor like the coward he was, Sophie had been planning to leave you anyway. The affair wasn't just about, you know. She wanted to divorce you, take everything, and start a new life with me. We talked about it. The house, the money, she wanted to sue you for everything. She thought it would be easy. I just stood there, trying to process it. This whole time, while I was working hard for my family, she had been planning to destroy everything we built together, to live in luxury with a man like him. But now that the plan failed, he added, glancing up at me, I'm not staying with her. She's lost everything. I can't be tied to that. I'm sorry, man. I didn't know it'd turn out like this. I couldn't help but laugh. The irony of it all, Sophie's grand plan to sue me for everything, to build her perfect life with Michael, had collapsed completely. And now, even he was walking away from her. She'd gambled everything and lost. I didn't hit him. I didn't raise my voice. In that moment, Michael wasn't worth my anger. He was just as pathetic as Sophie. But I wasn't about to let him walk away from this unscathed. A few days later, I sat down and wrote Michael a letter of recommendation, but not in the way most people would. No, I wrote down every single fact about his professionalism. How he crossed every line with his employer, betrayed the trust that had been given to him, and how he conducted himself not only as a driver but as a man who engaged in an affair with the wife of the man who had paid his salary. I made sure it was written calmly, just the facts, detailing exactly how he had operated while in my employment. I had no doubt this letter would follow him wherever he tried to work next. Any future employer, especially in good places, wouldn't want to hire a man with this kind of history. I didn't need to ruin him with my fists, I could ruin him with the truth. With the letter sealed and ready to go, I felt a sense of closure. Sophie and Michael were both out of my life. Their plan to use me, to take everything I had worked for, had failed spectacularly. And now, I had a fresh start. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. I was just relieved that they couldn't touch me or my kids anymore. The storm had passed, and I could finally begin to rebuild. It was a strange feeling, watching my life settle into a peaceful rhythm after all the chaos. The house was quieter, but in a good way. The kids were adjusting, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. No more lies, no more secrets hanging over my head. It was just me and them, rebuilding something better out of the wreckage. But then, just when I thought Sophie was gone for good, she came crawling back. Literally. It happened a few weeks after the custody hearing. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, there she was, Sophie, looking nothing like the woman I once knew. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a mess, and her eyes red from crying. She looked defeated. Broken. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake. I need you. I'm so sorry." I stood there, stunned for a moment. Was this real? The same woman who had threatened to take everything from me was now on her knees, begging for forgiveness. She dropped to the ground, tears streaming down her face. "Please. I'll do anything. I'll make it right. I didn't know what I was doing. I was stupid. I was selfish. I was wrong." She kept sobbing, gripping the edge of the doorway like she was afraid I'd slam it shut. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was the same person who had looked me in the eye and said she'd destroy me. The same person who had cheated on me, plotted to take everything, and dragged me through months of hell. And now, she wanted forgiveness. "Please, Daniel," she choked out, barely able to get the words out. "I can't live like this. I've lost everything. I have nothing left. Just, please give me another chance. For the kids." There was a time when I would have folded right there. A time when seeing her like this would have broken me. But that time had passed. She didn't just betray me, she betrayed our family, our children. There was no going back. "I'm sorry, Sophie," I said, my voice calm. "But it's too late." She looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and regret. I could see she was desperate, clinging to whatever hope she thought was left. But there was nothing left between us. Not anymore. You made your choices, I continued, stepping back into the house. And now you have to live with them. Before I shut the door, I paused and looked down at her, kneeling in front of me, her face streaked with tears. Wait, I said, my voice steady but cold. Before you go, I want to know something. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, looking up at me with desperate eyes. Anything, just ask. How exactly did you plan to sue me for everything? I asked, my voice calm but demanding the truth. Michael told me the two of you were plotting this all along. What was the plan? Sophie blinked, her lip trembling, clearly taken aback. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of it all was finally crashing down on her. It was all so stupid, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought, if I could paint you as the neglectful husband, the one too busy with work to care about his family, I could get full custody of the kids. And with that, I'd get the house, the money, everything. I just stared at her, the pieces falling into place. She had been trying to set me up for months, framing me as some absentee father while she was the perfect, stay-at-home mom. All while she was sneaking around with the driver, spinning her web of lies. And what about the affair? I pressed, still wanting to hear the full picture. Did you think that wouldn't come back to bite you? She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. I was careful. I thought if I kept everything hidden, you'd never find out. But Michael, he was supposed to keep quiet, and I thought if we got everything from you, we could move on. I could build a life with him, and it wouldn't matter what you thought. She paused, wiping her eyes again, her voice breaking. But then everything fell apart. You found out, and, now I've lost everything. I nodded slowly, feeling nothing but cold indifference. So it was all about the money. The house. You were willing to tear apart our family for that? She opened her mouth, but I didn't need to hear any more. I had my answer. This wasn't about love or regret, it was greed, plain and simple. She had been willing to sacrifice everything, including the kids, just for a life of comfort and security that she thought she could steal from me. I shook my head, more disappointed than angry. Thanks for the honesty, I said, stepping back. But it doesn't change anything. Before she could respond, I closed the door, shutting out the last remnants of the person I used to know. Sophie's plan had failed miserably, and in the end, she had nothing left, not even her dignity. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps as she walked away from the house she'd never see again. As I turned back toward my kids' rooms, I felt a strange sense of closure. Sophie had revealed the full depth of her betrayal, and now, there was nothing left for her to take from me. I was free. And with that, I could finally move on. And that's when I realized just how much my life had changed. A few months ago, I would have been devastated, angry, torn apart by what Sophie had done. But now, I felt free. For the first time in years, I was in control of my own life, not a victim of her manipulation. The kids were happier too, they were adjusting to the new normal, and so was I. With Sophie gone, my focus shifted entirely to them. I spent more time with them, made sure they knew they were loved and that everything was going to be okay. We had a new routine, one that wasn't built on lies. We started making plans, real plans for the future, vacations, family trips, the kind of life I had always wanted to give them. My work flourished too. Without the constant stress of my crumbling marriage hanging over me, I was able to throw myself into my business in a way I hadn't in years. Things started to fall into place. In the end, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need Sophie crawling back, begging for forgiveness. I had my kids, my home, and a fresh start. That was enough. Bye-bye.